Are you ready? First of all, we need to talk about the chloroplast, because the chloroplast is the place, if you like, in a plant cell where all the magic happens. If we've thought about respiration as being this process that oxidizes glucose and releases the energy, putting it into small packet forms that cells can use, you can kind of flip that whole thing and think photosynthesis is kind of the opposite. It's putting all that energy into a great big bulky unit in the first place. That energy of course comes from the sun. It's going to get locked into an organic carbon-based molecule. It's not going to be glucose. Glucose is not what photosynthesis makes, actually. That's one of the many things that we tell you in GCSE that is a lie. We're actually going to make a simpler sugar than that. And the chloroplast is the thing that's going to make it. So, before we go any further, let's just talk about the chloroplast. Just like the mitochondria, the chloroplast was once believed to be a free-living organism. It shares a lot of bacterial qualities, just like the mitochondria did. It has a double membrane, a folded inner membrane, that in this case makes stacks called thylakoids. Thylakoids are a little bit like the cristae in the mitochondria, except they're arranged in a sort of different way. A thylakoid is an individual folding of the membrane, and together the whole stack of thylakoids are called a granum. Think of thylakoids as being like a coin. Stacked on top of each other, the pile of coins is the granum. Feel free to Google mitochondria and have a look at a thylakoid and a granum, just so you are aware of what the heck I'm talking about. The fluid inside a chloroplast is called the stroma. Right? In the mitochondria, the fluid was called the matrix, if you remember. Well, in the chloroplast, it's the stroma. And the stroma, just like in the mitochondria, contains a lot of enzymes that are specific to the reactions that take place in that bit of the organelle. The thylakoids, just like in the mitochondria, are just folded membranes that have particular enzymes locked in that will carry out reactions in a particular order. In this case, the very complex reactions of photosynthesis. The key factor in a chloroplast is that on those thylakoid membranes there are molecules of basically pigments that can absorb light. Now in GCSE we referred to one of those pigments, which is chlorophyll, and that is true. Some of those molecules are chlorophyll molecules, but they're not the only things that absorb light. Light absorbing pigments are actually, well, quite varietous, but the main three that you guys would have to talk about would be chlorophyll A, which is the most important one, chlorophyll B, which is a slightly different version of chlorophyll that can absorb a slightly different wavelength of light, and something called carotenoids, which are a whole group of sort of extra pigments that can absorb bits of the spectrum of light that normal chlorophyll can't. Plants, and in this case chlorophyll, are only able to absorb certain bits of light. So the visible spectrum of light is where plants operate. It's the same bit of light that we're able to see. And if you know your physics, you'll know that visible light makes up a tiny portion of the EM spectrum, okay? All the way over here, we've got things like X-rays, all the way over here, things like radio waves, infrared, UV, but just in the middle there's a tiny portion, a little wavelength area that we can see, and that runs between 380 and 700 nanometers. At one end of that, we have things like blue light, which is high energy light, and that's made of photons that are high energy photons. On the other side of the visible spectrum is red light. Red light is made of red photons, which are lower energy photons. Light acts as a particle and as a wave. We're not going to get into that because that's physics and but it does. Red light has a longer wavelength, a lower frequency. Blue light has a short wavelength, high frequency, high energy waves. Plants are able to absorb the red and the blue end of the spectrum to some degree. It's the middle bit of the spectrum they are not good at absorbing. That's the bit of the spectrum that appears green. That stuff is reflected off of the plants, which is why all plants look green. It's the bit they don't absorb. Inside the chloroplast, if we zoomed in, we'd get to those stacks of thylakoids. If you zoomed into the membrane of a thylakoid, you'd come across things called photosystems. So before we get into photosynthesis, it's also important you understand what those things are. Photosystems are essentially, in the membranes of the thylakoids, we have a protein that goes through the entire membrane. So remember, we have names for that. It's called an intrinsic protein or an integral protein. Those proteins span the membrane of the thylakoid, and on the top of the membrane, facing out towards the light, there are chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and carotenoid pigments on the surface of the protein. So light that hits that protein will hit these photosynthetic pigments. When light hits those pigments, light can be absorbed, and the energy in that light is passed around between those different pigment molecules until eventually that energy is collected by a chlorophyll A molecule. That chlorophyll A molecule will lose an electron, which becomes excited because of that light that has hit it. That electron is passed into the protein, and that protein acts as something called an electron acceptor, and it holds on to that high energy electron temporarily. Those pigments at the top of that protein and the protein itself that can pick up the electron, that entire thing is called a photosystem. And in chloroplasts there are actually two types, strangely called photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. Now we'll get into all that stuff later, but for now I'm going to ask you a few questions on all that stuff I've just said, and I want you guys to see if you can answer them. Feel free to save this video so that you can look back and find your answers or consult it for revision later. But either way, we're going to get into this. A bit of time for questions at the end of the lesson as well, and we'll maybe have time to move on. Alright, I got coffee to drink, you got questions to answer. Let's do this.